I used to believe that marriage would be more fun, a journey of shared laughter and adventure, but as I immersed myself in work, the years slipped by unnoticed. And suddenly, I was 43. The thought of facing the future alone made me uneasy. That was when I met him, a quiet, reassuring man, 2 years older than me. Over time, he captured my heart. 6 months after we began dating, we got married and moved into a new house to start our life together. We cherished one another and made a pact to always discuss any problems openly. This approach made our marriage strong, and for a time, I believed we were the perfect couple. Despite aging, our married life felt fulfilling. Then, dark clouds loomed over our relationship. The turning point came when my parents-in-law decided to divorce. My husband explained that his parents' marriage had been strained for years due to a lack of communication, especially after he and his sister became independent. While we were initially inclined to think their divorce wouldn't affect us, the truth turned out to be far more disruptive. Since my first meeting with my in-laws before marriage, my relationship with my mother-in-law had been challenging. Over time, her dissatisfaction grew. She criticized everything I did, from my cooking to my cleaning schedule. Worse, her disapproval extended to personal attacks, calling my clothing unfashionable and even criticizing my appearance. It felt like she despised my very existence. To cope, I minimized interactions with her, a strategy my husband supported. Still, I worried her hostility might escalate after the divorce. Then there was my sister-in-law, who lived with my parents-in-law, unmarried and in her 40s. She had no steady job, spending her days idling or working part-time for quick cash. She often borrowed money from my husband and me, claiming it was for small expenses like books or games. While the amounts were modest, the frequency was draining. My husband assured me he would handle it, but my sister-in-law often approached me when I was alone, leaving me unable to refuse. Their behavior became unbearable. Visiting my in-laws felt like walking into an ambush, as though I was a money tree for them to exploit. Gradually, my husband and I distanced ourselves from their home. I dreaded the changes the divorce might bring and silently wished to remain uninvolved. But my hopes were short-lived. Just days after their divorce was finalized, the doorbell rang early one morning at 5 a.m. No less. Half asleep, I wondered who could be visiting at such an ungodly hour. When I opened the door, there they stood, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, grinning and holding large bags. Instantly, I regretted answering. Surprised, I asked, "What do you need at this early hour?" My mother-in-law ignored my question entirely and said, "You're late. Let us in already." Taken aback, I hurriedly asked, "What's with the bags? Where are you going?" She brushed past me with an air of entitlement. "What do you mean? Where are we going? We're here. We've come to stay." Still groggy from being woken up at 5 a.m., I struggled to process her words. It felt as though they had fled from somewhere. Arriving unannounced with their belongings, they pushed their way into the house, disregarding my confusion and protests. "What happened?" I demanded, blocking their path as best I could. My mother-in-law, looking down on me with disdain, replied as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You should already understand. We're moving in. Starting now." "Moving in? What are you talking about? I haven't heard anything about this." I was still groggy, my low morning blood pressure keeping me sluggish. "Even so," I argued. "What situation? Is this about the divorce? But why here? My husband hasn't said anything about this." They ignored me, dragging their bags into the house and making themselves at home, commandeering our storage room without hesitation. My pleas for an explanation went unanswered. Instead, my mother-in-law shot me a glare and said coldly, "Our family is in trouble. Don't you have a heart, or even basic empathy? That's why you're such a terrible daughter-in-law." I was stunned into silence. At that moment, my husband, a self-professed non-morning person, rushed into the commotion, His surprise at seeing his mother and sister with their bags was evident. "Why are you here so early? And what's with all the luggage?" My mother-in-law reiterated her intention to stay, recognizing that my husband was better suited to deal with the situation. I stepped back, though I could hear them beginning to spread their belongings out as if the house were their own. Despite my husband's initial protests, he eventually relented and agreed to let them stay temporarily, for 1 month. This was, I realized, a major concession on his part, driven by his sense of familial duty. Though I wanted to send them packing, I knew they were still his family. In the days that followed, we cleared out the storage room for their use. I found myself preparing 3 meals a day for them, as though I were running a boarding house. They offered no help whatsoever, instead treating themselves as guests. If meals weren't ready on time, my mother-in-law would make sarcastic remarks like, "Isn't it ready yet? I'm starving." Or does this house take pleasure in keeping its family hungry? I bit my tongue, silently retorting, "How can you be so hungry when all you do is sit around all day?" But I avoided confrontation, knowing it would only lead to more insults. At first, I continued to cook for them, but over time, I began to question my compliance. Why was I accommodating their demands when they contributed nothing? They spent their days lounging in the living room, watching TV, and barking orders: prepare the bath, bring coffee, serve snacks, vacuum the floor. By the end of the first week, I was already nearing my breaking point. I was mentally and emotionally drained. To make matters worse, my sister-in-law shamelessly extended her hand and said, "Give me some pocket money." Startled, I asked, "What do you need it for?" With an air of childish defiance, she snapped, "Why do I have to explain that to you?" It was incomprehensible to me why I should hand over money to someone who refused to contribute to household chores or expenses. However, I knew that if I confronted her, she would immediately run to my mother-in-law, escalating the hostility. To avoid further conflict, I kept my response minimal. "You're not my child," I said flatly. Her reaction was swift and indignant. "You're letting your sister-in-law suffer in this house," she exclaimed dramatically, as though she were a victim. Neither my mother-in-law nor my sister-in-law contributed a single penny to the household. The cost of their meals and other expenses fell entirely on us, as if it were a natural obligation. On top of that, their constant demands for pocket money added to our financial burden. Their brazenness was astonishing. Every evening, my husband would comfort me, urging patience while also warning them sternly. But as soon as he left for work, they reverted to their entitled behavior, acting as if anything was permissible in his absence. The promised 1-month stay came and went with no sign of them leaving. Looking back, it was evident they had planned to exploit my husband's kindness all along. Their attitudes grew increasingly arrogant. My sister-in-law began calling me wife in a mocking, childish tone, while my mother-in-law continued her condescending remarks. I avoided responding, as even hearing their voices exhausted me. Day by day, I felt my resolve breaking. I can't live like this anymore. I'm at my limit. I have to do something, I told myself repeatedly. Around this time, my husband had been promoted at work, a joyous occasion, but it came with a scheduled week-long business trip. He was hesitant to leave, worried about leaving me to deal with his family alone. "I'll postpone the trip until we've sorted this out," he said. But I didn't want his career to suffer because of our personal troubles. "It's only a week," I reassured him. "If it gets too bad, I'll just stay at a hotel." With that, I sent him off, determined to confront the situation head-on. The moment my husband left, their behavior escalated. They acted more entitled than ever, making outrageous demands as if they owned the house. When they called out to me during my chores, I finally said, "Please handle it yourselves." That simple statement unleashed a torrent of complaints. My mother-in-law sneered, "You're my son's wife, and yet you can't even manage the basics?" In my time, Arguing wasn't allowed. Your way of thinking is so naive. Their mockery of my struggles seemed to amuse them. Watching me flustered and upset became their form of entertainment. I knew I had to regain control. 3 days into my husband's trip, my mother-in-law threw another sarcastic remark my way. "Can't you even manage what I asked you to do yesterday? Are you really that incompetent?" Her tone was biting. Her words meant to provoke. When I stayed silent, she pressed on. "You always look dissatisfied. If you have something to say, just say it already." This was the moment I had been waiting for, a chance to confront them. Taking a deep breath, I finally let out my pent-up frustrations. "Mother," I began calmly but firmly, "it's clear you enjoy tormenting me, but I'm not your maid. At the very least, I expect basic adult manners from you." She looked at me, startled. As I continued, "You demand I prioritize your every whim over my busy schedule. That's called selfishness. And asking for money without contributing anything? That's mooching. How can you expect to be treated as decent adults when you don't act like it? You're both old enough to know better. Sister, you're in your 40s. Mother, you're not far behind. Or are you regressing into children? Do I need to take you to a doctor?" My bluntness left them momentarily speechless. Their faces turned red as they processed my words. "How dare you speak to me like that?" my mother-in-law finally shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "You have no right to be so impudent." My sister-in-law joined in, declaring, "If you can't serve us, you're useless." Finally, my mother-in-law spat out, "It's unthinkable for a daughter-in-law to act like this. If you can't respect us, get out of this house." I was stunned by the words "get out." This house belonged to my husband and me. The audacity of these freeloaders, who had barged into our home uninvited, now demanding I leave, was beyond belief. But I couldn't afford to lose this battle. I needed a plan, and fast. Then, an idea struck me, a way to turn the situation to my advantage. Though I'd need my husband's consent later, I decided to act swiftly. Feigning remorse, I said, "I'm sorry. My words earlier were too harsh. As an apology, how about I fund a trip for you both? A nice getaway. My treat." As expected, their eyes lit up at the mention of a trip. "That's fine," my mother-in-law said, feigning dignity, while my sister-in-law grinned triumphantly. I added casually, "Oh, and during your trip, I'll also be leaving for a while." My sister-in-law clapped her hands in delight. "Really? You're leaving? Great! Now this will finally be our house." Though my mother-in-law maintained a composed demeanor, I could tell she was pleased. I wasted no time arranging a week-long spa trip for them, ensuring they'd be out of the house. The very next day, they left, eager for their vacation. With the house to myself, the real work began. I immediately informed my husband of everything. He was fully on board with the plan. True to my word, I packed up our belongings and relocated to my parents' house a few train stops away. Upon arriving, I explained the situation to my parents. They were initially shocked but soon embraced me with understanding and support. With their help, I arranged for movers to transfer our belongings to a rented storage unit. By the day before my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were due to return, everything was prepared. The house was emptied, and I was mentally and physically ready for the final showdown. The day of their return arrived, and as expected, my phone rang. "What's going on?" my mother-in-law screamed. "We can't get into the house. It's covered in tarps, and strangers are destroying it." I held the phone away from my ear to shield myself from the shouting and replied calmly, "Welcome back. How was your trip?" "Don't play dumb," my sister-in-law screeched. "Why is the house being demolished?" Remaining composed, I explained, "Oh, those are contractors. I told you before. We were leaving the house. It's being demolished because we don't need it anymore." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. followed by a panicked demand for clarification. "This house was inherited from my father," I said evenly. "After deciding to leave, we concluded it was more practical to demolish the old building and sell the land. My husband and I both agreed this was the best course of action." But, where are we supposed to go?" my mother-in-law cried, her earlier confidence shattered. I couldn't suppress a slight laugh. "Your belongings have already been sent to your husband's house. He's aware of the situation and will handle it from here." Realizing the gravity of the situation, they panicked further, their voices growing increasingly frantic. I ended the conversation politely but firmly, leaving them to process the reality of their predicament. Later, I learned from my husband that their father had harshly reprimanded them, leaving them with no choice but to spend the night in a nearby motel. When they reached out to my husband for help, his usual calm demeanor gave way to fury. He delivered a strict lecture and declared, "I will no longer have any dealings with either of you." This effectively severed ties between us and them. In the months that followed, my mother-in-law took up a job as a cleaner in a motel, while my sister-in-law juggled part-time jobs, struggling to find stable housing. Their self-centered behavior led to frequent conflicts with relatives and acquaintances who temporarily took them in, resulting in repeated evictions. Meanwhile, my husband and I moved to a new rental property closer to his workplace. It was cozy, peaceful, and a fresh start for us. On the site of our old house, construction began on a new, modern single-family home. Once completed, it will mark the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, one free of unwelcome guests and filled with happiness and tranquility.